A guten Erev Shabbos. A kid comes home from Hebrew school and his father asks him, "What did you learn?" So the boy says he learned all about the children of Israel and their journey through the desert. He learned that the children of Israel had to spend 40 years of wandering in the desert because the children of Israel were still not ready to go into the land of Israel quite yet. Then he said, "Dad, there's one thing that I don't understand about the children of Israel spending all that time in the desert." His father says, "What's that, son?" The kid says, "Where were all the grown-ups all this time?" Of course, not all jokes are funny all the time. Ones that work, sometimes, have at least a grain of truth to them that makes us recognize ourselves in the story. When you think of a journey, a trip, a voyage, at some point along the way, someone asks the essential, basic question, are we there yet? When are we going to get there? How much longer is it? There's a bit of grown-up wisdom from Emerson that says that it's not just the destination, it's the journey, or also the journey, that has meaning, which is really a way to talk about life and changes and the effort we put in to get where we're going or where we think we're going. But at the same time, the whole point of the journey is to get where we're going, so really the destination is the whole point. Unless, of course, you're on a cruise or a ride at Disney World or Canada's Wonderland where you go around and wind up exactly where you started, but that's for another time. The journeys that are recounted in Parshas Masei that we're reading this week in tandem with Parshas Matos are 42 in number, and there may be another 7 not recorded to total 49. Last week we mentioned the idea of 50 journeys in all. However you do the accounting, there are a lot of journeys. Midrash Rabbah reminds us of the key word that introduces this part of this week's reading, Eila, these. Every place in the Torah where we have an Eila, of these, to introduce a new part of the story, it's to separate what follows from what comes before. Like in the story of Genesis, where it says, "These are the generations of heaven and earth, Eila toldos hashamayim v'aretz," to distinguish the chaos of before with the order and purpose of creation that followed. And every place we have ve'ela, and these are the things, it's to establish a connection between what comes before and what follows. So, in the section of Masei, Eile Masei b'nei Yisrael, these are the journeys, the travels of the children of Israel, and the grown-ups too. What's the distinction that's to be made? Orach Chaim HaKadosh has a couple of thoughts about what might be going on here. One is that the Eile here distinguishes all other journeys of humankind, whether or not they're recorded in our books or anyone's, from the unique and distinct journey of Bnei Yisrael out of Egypt and to Mount Sinai, and ultimately, 40 years later, into the land of Israel. There was nothing like it before or since. And yet, he argues with his own suggestion, saying that if it were a record of outstanding human achievement, if we drew great inspiration from the travels of Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar, fine. But what do we have? First of all, desperation at the sea before it splits. Some wanted to commit suicide, some wanted to go back and return to slavery if it meant preserving their lives. We made it through that. We stood together to receive the Torah. And what happened next? The golden calf. Commandment that we heard, Mipia Gvura, from God directly. I am God, your God, who took you out of Egypt. Don't have any other gods before me. Our action? Make a golden calf and worship this chintzy idol as if it were a god. Not off to a great start by any stretch. Then, the spies who were supposed to check out the land, do reconnaissance, and help plan our entrance and our conquest of Israel, but they chickened out. And the ensuing decree of 40 years of wandering to take the slavery out of the Jews. Then, the Ma'apilim, who disregarded the plan and headed off to Israel anyway, only to meet a speedy demise. Then Korach, then the Midianite women. Really, the saga of the desert is a series of mishaps, misadventures, and none too glorious events that make the Bnei Yisrael, make the Jewish people sound all too pedestrian, pardon the double entendre, all too ordinary, and all too undistinguished. So the Orach Chaim, Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar, also cites a Yalkut Shimoni that describes God's desire to give the Torah to the Jews immediately after our departure from Egypt so that we'd quickly grasp our national mission and purpose. Yet, as the Torah itself says in Proverbs, Kol nesivoseh shalom, all the Torah's paths are peace, But every time the Jewish people stopped along the journey, there was fighting, strife, bitterness, resentment, and disunity, the opposite of the environment where Torah flourishes. Hardly exemplary, to put it mildly. So, now, the Or HaChaim has to come up with a different explanation for what's going on here, and here's what he suggests. Perhaps, he says, perhaps the distinction in journeys is between two types that the Jewish people ventured on different stages of our liberation. One was the planned journeys out of Egypt to Mount Sinai at the outset of our liberation, our wilderness experience, before the decree that it would take 40 years eventually to reach our destination, as opposed to a few weeks. If we had behaved, had we conducted ourselves as befitting a nation with such a special calling and mission, the 40 years might not have occurred. Or HaChaim's suggestion is to look at the Eila as demarcating the negative parts of the positive parts of the journey and the positive parts of the negative era. The first are those times early in the adventure when we were headed out of slavery toward freedom, ready to receive the Torah, but we acted with great strife and disunity and rebellion. The other side of the coin is the long sojourn in the desert, decade after decade, which through its tribulations prepared us for our arrival in Israel. Here we learned better how to get along. Here we learned the value of community. Here we learned to make the most of whatever we experienced, wherever and whatever it was, truly to appreciate the value of the journey and not just the destination. The Zohar's perspective on this might be familiar to us. Our time in the wilderness was, in part, a gathering of nitzotzos of Kedusha, sparks of sanctity that were also in exile, to find them, to refine them, to elevate them, and make even the desert a holier and more godly place. This is the notion that wherever a person goes, whatever situations occur, a person has the opportunity, if we choose to take it, to make something good happen, something transcendent and even holy. It's a long journey from the Zohar to Dr. Frankl's book, Viktor Frankl's book that we've been studying closely on Tuesdays, Man's Search for Meaning. Then again, perhaps the connection is closer than we realize. Dr. Frankl, to my knowledge, was no student of Jewish mysticism, and yet he may well have divined a similar truth even without familiarity with those texts. And while it's true that the sojourn in Egypt itself, not to mention the journeys of the patriarchs, which also had something to do with finding and emphasizing holiness in various places outside of Israel, it seems, at least in Rabbi Ibn Attar's view, there's no comparison between anything that went before and the mission of the entire Jewish nations. Hundreds of thousands of us coming together and making our way forward as one community, ever more unified in purpose as we neared our goal of the land of Israel. In fact, he refers to a Mechilta that deals with the question as to why the Torah wasn't given to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Were they unworthy? Were they unwilling? Other Midrashim argue that they did, in fact, keep the entire Torah by intuition, even before it was given publicly, which is a fascinating idea to think about. The reason given ultimately is that they themselves were appropriate as individuals, but they lacked the strength of numbers. They lacked the shlemos, the completeness of legions, of an entire nation that could carry and sustain this set of divine commandments and apply it in the practical world, both in the desert and ultimately in the land of Israel. For that, you need a nation, not just a family. The opening verse itself implies this, says the Or HaChaim, in that it says, Eile Masei B'nei Yisrael. These are the journeys of B'nei Yisrael, Asher Yatzu Mitzrayim L'Tzevaisam, who came out of Egypt in their legions, or in their hosts. The greatest spiritual power, the greatest potential, was when those who left Egypt still formed those legions as they began to pass away as the years went by. The spiritual strength of the Am waned to a certain extent, as those present were no longer, in the main, those who had endured the formative crucible of Egyptian exile. And the verse finishes, Biyad Moshe v'Aaron, as these leaders were those who were best equipped to fuse the nation together with all of our capabilities and our experiences and maximize all the potential of the journey, however long it was meant to be. So back to the notion of journey and destination and where the real value lies. As we said, getting there is the whole point of the journey. But if the journey is no more than the means to an end, how is it supposed to have any value in and of itself? Perhaps we can look at each week or each year or even a lifetime as just such a journey. Of course, we're looking forward to the end stage, reaching the goal, arriving there, wherever there might be. And yet we find purpose and meaning and value in the path itself. We cannot overlook the small moments, the faint sparks that the Zohar was drawing our attention to, opportunities for real and lasting change, transformation that occur along the way if we're paying attention. One of my favorite stories in this vein involves a rabbi and his critics who were walking along in Vienna through the Prater Park 120 years or so ago. The critics were picking on his innovation, his out-of-the-box perspective. Finally, the rabbi turned to the critics and says, Look down there at the side of the path. You see that flower there? They did. Isn't it a beautiful flower, he said. They had to agree. It's a beautiful flower. So the rabbi said to them, now, did I invent that flower? Did I bring it into being? Or did I merely draw your attention to it? They had to admit it was the latter. But he said, had I not drawn your attention to it, would you have noticed it? They had to agree that they would have overlooked it. That's the opportunity that Matos Masei B'nai Yisrael offers us. With the guidance of our teachers, our leaders, our sages, we are going somewhere. We are a people with a mission. We have a goal, we have a plan, and at the same time we possess the tools, the perspectives, the insight, and at least in theory the patience and perseverance to make the most of every opportunity along the way, to make good things happen for others and even for ourselves, to bring things to light that may have been overlooked, to liberate those things hidden out of view or in darkness that, like us, long to be free and pursue their highest calling. As we enter on Friday into the month of Av, whose first week and a half are overshadowed by mourning for what we have lost, may we use it and the weeks that follow to find new things in and around ourselves and turn even these days of sadness into redemptive happiness and joy. Shabbat Shalom.